Alright guys, MTech Guy here. Now it's a beautiful day down here on the South Island this morning, and I thought I'd take this opportunity to have a good chat about preventative maintenance for your E60 M5. Alright, so maybe you've just bought one of these cars, or maybe you've owned one for a little while and you've been enjoying that ownership experience, but you haven't yet got stuck in to that maintenance. But listen, if you own one of these cars, you better look at looking after it properly, because if you don't, you'll be going on an adventure, and it'll be one heck of an adventure full of pain, financial hardship and psychological distress. So we want to look at carrying out this preventative maintenance to mitigate the pain and increase your ownership experience enjoyment. Now there's lots of common failure points on these cars. There's lots of components that can fail over time, just like any car. But today we're not going to look at rebuilding the whole car. We're just going to focus on the items that are either going to cause catastrophic failure or are likely to leave you stranded. So things like water pumps, they don't really fail that frequently on these cars, unlike a lot of other BMW engines. And then if you look at the throttle actuators, that's a common failure point on these cars, but even when they do start failing, it's not going to leave you stranded. So today we're just going to focus on the big items that are likely to leave you stranded or cause you catastrophic failure, which is going to cost you thousands in repairs. Okay, so the first thing we want to be looking at, especially if you've just recently bought one of these cars, it's a nice, easy, quick job. It's not going to cost you any money, and it's only going to take you a couple of hours or so, and that's give the car a good wash, and then we're going to clean all the drain points. We're talking about sunroof drains, the drains around the bulkhead, the firewall, the door jambs, and then around the rear quarters and the wheel wells there. Now I've made a previous video on this process. I'll leave a link to it at the top of the screen. Now it's really worth getting this done. It's a nice, easy job, and if you leave this, these cars are very prone to water ingress. So what will happen is them drain points will get blocked with dirt, leaves and debris, and then over time, when it's been raining or when you washed the car, that water will start backing up against them drain points, and it's going to end up getting into the interior of the car. So it'll be getting into the boot area, the trunk area floor, inside the cabin of the car, into your floors, under the seats, and also in the bulkhead area where most of your ECUs are stored. And of course, with a car like this, with as many computers as this car has got, that's the last thing you want. So what can start happening once you get water ingress is that it'll corrode the connectors, it'll get in and start frying the modules, and then what'll happen is you'll have a hell of a time trying to diagnose what's going on. And when you do eventually find it, you're going to be replacing modules, replacing connectors. You've got to go through a reprogramming process with them new modules. It's a complete nightmare, and it's going to cost you a heck of a lot of money. You don't want to go there, and it can be mitigated so easily. So before you do anything, make sure that them drain points are nice and clear. Okay, so the second thing, and this goes without saying, I know most of you guys frequently change your engine oil, but you want to be looking at getting this done if you've just bought the car, or if you've not done it so far during your ownership. You want to go through and replace all the fluids of the car. So we're talking about engine oil, obviously, the gearbox oil, your SMG gear oil, your differential oil, your power steering fluid, and your brake fluid. Because listen, these cars are getting on a bit now. This one's around about 16 years old now, and a lot of the time it's not uncommon for most of these fluids never to have been replaced, especially your differential gearbox fluid. Even the brake fluid, you're supposed to replace that every 2 years, and it's surprising how many people don't bother with it. So go through the whole car, get all fresh fluids right the way through the car, and then that'll give you a good starting point moving forward, and it's going to flush any particles, anything like that, any bad oil, any moisture. It's going to get it all out of there, and you've got some nice clean fresh fluid. It's a good way to move forward with the car. Alright, so next up we're going to move to the back end of the car, and we're going to look at installing a new fuel filter. Now this is another item that does get overlooked, but it's very important on these cars, because even though it always gets talked about how the rod bearings fail on these engines, it's catastrophic failure, this, that and the other thing, something that doesn't get talked about that often that does cause catastrophic failure, and it happens way more often than people realise, is that the fuel injectors can get stuck open over time when they start getting dirty, or when the injectors themselves start failing. And then what happens is them injectors start leaking and dumping fuel in the cylinders unbeknown to the owner. So you'll leave it sat overnight, and that injector will just start dripping fuel. It'll fill up the cylinder, you'll come the next day, you'll go to crank the engine over, and you're going to hydrolock the engine, because of course that fuel isn't going to compress. And then that normally leads to a bent rod, which then leads to damage of the cylinder walls, and then you're in a world of pain. You'll probably be looking at a new block, a thorough rebuild of that block. There's a whole process to go through, which is a bit of a nightmare. There might not be any coming back from it. Usually that's the case. It's usually cheaper just to put a second-hand engine in the car. These S85 V10s aren't cheap, even on the second-hand market, so you want to keep away from that as much as you can. So starting at the source of the fuel supply, you want to be making sure that all the fuel that's been delivered to the engine of yours, your S85 V10, is super clean, and it's removed any particles that are going to cause any damage to your injectors. So make sure that you chuck a brand new fuel filter in there if it hasn't been done recently already. Now moving on from the fuel filter, next up we're going to move on to the injectors themselves. Now like I say, these cars are getting on a bit now. Most of them are still on the original injectors. So just go through and replace all 10 injectors. Just chuck a new set in there. You can get the old ones cleaned up and tested, but by the time you've spent all the money on that, you might as well just be buying new ones. There's not much difference in the price. So go get yourself a whole set of new injectors, and then you know moving forward you're going to get at least 10 years out of them before they might start giving you a few issues, but it's just going to mitigate that engine hydrolock scenario that we want to keep well clear of. So it's an exercise. It's not too expensive for the parts. If you're doing it yourself, it's not too bad. There's a bit of labour involved if you're paying a garage to do it, but nonetheless it's money well spent, so just get it done. Alright, so now that we've moved on to the front of the car, the engine bay, the next item that we're going to look at getting replaced is the engine cooling thermostat. Now, these do fail frequently on these cars, and unfortunately when they do fail, they fail safe, they fail wide open. But what that means is when you jump in the car from cold, it's going to take a long time for that engine oil to warm up. Now, these engines running 10W60 do take a long time anyway to warm up, but with a wide open thermostat that's stuck open right from cold, it's going to take a long time for that engine oil to warm up. And what can happen if you start creeping up in your revs before that engine oil's up to temperature? It can start damaging your rod bearings. Like we've talked about on many of our previous videos, one of the key items to longevity with these S85 V10 engines is to make sure you warm the car up properly before you start putting your foot down, before you start enjoying the high rev range of these engines. And it's worth mentioning that usually the thermostats will fail slowly over time, so it'll just creep up. It won't just be like one day it only takes 10 minutes to warm up the engine, and then the next day it's failed and it's going to take you half an hour for the engine oil to get up to temperature. It will creep up slowly, just a little bit at a time normally, so you might not notice it straight away. And look, the thermostats are relatively cheap, and it's a great opportunity to get the coolant changed out in your engine also, so why not just get it done. Okay, then moving from the top side of the engine down into the depths of the engine bay, we're going to take a look at the alternator. Now, another frequent failure point with these cars is the alternator voltage regulator. So not the alternator itself, just the voltage regulator that's bolted to it. Now, when these do start failing, again, they don't always just fail completely straight away. They will start failing over a long period of time, and what it can cause is a lot of electrical issues, charging issues, but they'll be so minute that although the car won't stop straight away, it's going to cause you a lot of headaches, it's going to cause you a lot of little electrical gremlins, but ultimately when it does fail, it will leave you stranded. So again, it's not a very expensive part, but there is a reasonable amount of labour in getting the alternator out of there. You can just about do it in position, but it's such a struggle, you might as well just pull the alternator right out. You might take the opportunity just to put a complete new alternator in the car, and it's not a bad idea. Like I say, these cars are getting on a bit now. This one's getting on for 16 years old, but nonetheless, the voltage regulator is a cheap part. Just get a new one, chuck it in there, and it's going to save you a whole heap of trouble, a whole heap of headaches later on. Now, these items that we're going through today, you don't necessarily need to go and get the whole lot done all at once. You might choose to do it over a few months, over a small period of time, maybe 8, 10, 12 months, you never know, but something you want to be working towards. You don't necessarily have to do it straight away. The final thing you want to be looking at doing is putting a new set of rod bearings in the engine. Because of course, with these cars, with the S85 V10, it is a wear item, and it's worth chucking a new set in there before they do cause you damage later on. Now, what mileage you choose to do that at, what age of the car you choose to do that at, that's entirely up to you. but you're far better off doing it preventatively before they do start failing. So you want to be ahead of the game, keep on the front foot with it. So you want to be putting a new set of rod bearings in there, and at the same time, when you've got the oil pan off, you want to look at putting a new Vanos high pressure oil line in there also. Now the reason being, these do fail, especially on the earlier cars. What can happen is they can start to leak internally in your engine, and then what happens is you lose that Vanos pressure, and it can cause all kind of running problems. So it's worth chucking a new one in when you're in there. It's not a very expensive part either. And then also, while you've got the oil pan off, you're doing the rod bearings, you're doing that Vanos line, the high pressure Vanos line, it's worth just pulling your Vanos pump out, pull it apart and have a good look at it, give it a good inspection, whether it's you that's doing it or maybe you're paying a garage to do it. Just make sure there's no damage, because you might catch something earlier on that you can either rebuild the pump, or more than likely you might want to chuck a new one in there. It might look fine and then just put it all back together, but that's going to save you a big headache later on also. But listen, doing the rod bearings, the high pressure Vanos line and inspecting the Vanos pump, it's not a 5-minute job. It is a very involved job. It can cost you a fair bit of money if you're paying someone to do the labour. The parts aren't really that expensive. Unless you're putting a new Vanos pump in, then it can get expensive, but it's definitely worth doing on these cars. And if you do that, the car's going to be good for another 10 years at least, if you look after it properly, if you let the oil warm up properly. But it's not something you have to dive in and do it immediately, but it is worth planning for it. You might want to save some money up for it over several few months, over a long period of time, and then you'll be ready for it. So if you haven't done it, or you're not going to do it immediately, just make sure you plan for it. Alright guys, so there we have it. There's a few tips for you on preventative maintenance for your E60 M5, and that's going to save you a whole world of pain, and it's going to increase your ownership experience enjoyment, and that's what we want. Nobody said that owning an E60 M5 with that S85 V10 engine was going to be easy, but if you go about it the right way, it's not a big deal. Now listen, if you think I've missed anything important in today's video, or if you can think of a really important preventative maintenance item that's worth considering, make sure you talk about it in the comments below, and it just puts the information out there for the M5 community. It all helps everybody out. If you found the video interesting or useful, don't forget to give it a like, and make sure you go and check out the rest of my YouTube channel for more BMW E60 M5 content. I'm MTech Guy. Thanks a lot for watching.